At Quite the Thing Media, we aim to bring you the best podcasts produced by independent creators, made without constraints.
Podcast Father here. Join me on my journey as I start out as the indie podcaster.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artists? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster with your host, the Podcast Father.
Welcome, everybody. Let me sing you a song. This is Indie Podcaster. I'm Jeff. Mike, you're with me. How did the Podcast Father just sound singing? Was that
that was good. Before you even asked me how it was, I was thinking this is so nice because that's exactly how I start most of my podcasts, but I never mean to. I just hit the recording button and sometimes you just sing. It just comes out. It's good though.
Thanks. It was real. It came from the heart.
So real. Genuine, yeah.
So like I said, I'm Jeff, a.k.a. Podcast Father. Mike's with me. He's from the podcast, his own podcast, The Link, a podcast with Mike. Zago.
At the link _ podcast on Twitter and Instagram. Check it out. It's fun.
Find him on Twitter and make sure you report everything he does.
Yeah, sure. It would still be content because then I could post about it at least. I'll post that on Instagram, get some likes.
Speaking of reports, Mike, this interview today is...
That was good. That was slick.
Yeah, I know, right? I've been practicing. So I'm excited about this one. Not only is Andy McGrillen a great guy that I talk with, personally, we're involved with Quite the Thing Media. His podcast, That UFO Podcast, is really starting to get big. And it makes sense, right? Because everything going on with the world, all these task force reports we're seeing, this subject is really gaining popularity.
It's insane. It's insane that COVID happened. And I feel like the world just kind of snuck in. Oh, by the way, UFOs exist. And everyone's like, all right, well, we got stuff to do, man. We can't deal with this right now. And now that we're coming out of it, we're like, wait, remember when they said UFOs just exist? And this is like one of the best places to go for it because they interview the top people. There's always interesting stories. It's hard not to be interesting when talking about this. The one thing I am annoyed by, though, are they changing it from UFO to UAP? Is that a thing? You know about this?
Yeah. I don't know if they're changing it. I think it's just, I guess they did, but I think it's a personal preference because there's still people that say UFO. I say UFO.
I know. I'm trying to figure out who UFO offended. You know what I mean? Did someone see like a bird we didn't recognize and be like, that would be a UFO? And then someone got mad because it's not an alien? Someone's got to explain it to me. That said, this is a super interesting podcast. It's really fun. It lets you put on your tinfoil hat a little bit, but then again, the stuff is real and it's literally documented by experts. So it's this weird feeling you get, but it's really cool.
Damn it, Mike. This isn't Signs with Mel Gibson. This is legitimate.
No,
researcher.
That's what's so cool about it. It's like, it feels like 20 years ago, we would have thought that it was insane. And now we live in this world where we have documented stuff and experts who can report on these things and you get to hear about it. It's awesome.
What about you? You have any experiences with coming across a UFO or anything like that at all?
I have enough trouble getting through my day and figuring out what to eat for dinner and record the podcast.
Well, you don't leave your apartment. So you don't leave your apartment. I mean,
not much, but it's hot up here. And then I go outside and it's hotter out there. It's like, come on, can we get back to winter? No one has ever said that. It's not real. I meant it, but I also didn't mean it. I take it back.
Before you get off on more of a soapbox, let's dive into this interview with Andy of That UFO Podcast. You will enjoy it. But before we start that, give me a second to take care of a little business. Myself and this podcast are proud members of Quite the Thing Media. Make sure you're checking out Quite the Thing Media. Go to quitethethingmedia.com. If you want to go to my personal site, it's actually at Quite the Thing Media. quitethingmedia.com/podcastfather. There you can request to be on this podcast as a guest. Also, a review from me on site. Make sure you're checking out all the great original podcasts on site and the independent creators on site. quitethingmedia.com. Couldn't do this podcast without the hosting platform Captivate FM. Captivate FM is great, guys. I can't tell you how great it is. I could talk about it all day, but I will tell you one thing. For me, as a new podcaster, it's amazing. There's all sorts of tools, growth labs, etc. The team is so hands-on at Captivate FM. They will help you through your journey. If you're a podcaster or content creator, you want to distribute your stuff, go to CaptivateFM.com. They'll go ahead and give you 7 free days off the bat. But I'll tell you what, if you go to my Quite the Thing Media page, quitethethingmedia.com/podcastfather, there at the bottom, you'll find an affiliate link. You can get 30 days of Captivate FM free. Why wouldn't you check it out? Captivate FM. This podcast is sponsored by Good Pods, my great friends at Good Pods. This is an amazing app, guys. You get on there, you see what podcasts your friends and influencers are listening to. Download the Good Pods app. All the music on this podcast is from the artist Young Carts. Young Carts, great independent artist. You got to check out all the work. Go to the site, youngcartsbeats.com. If you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter at podcast_father, or the podcast actually has an account too at indie_podcaster, or good old fashioned email, always great too, thepodcastfather@gmail.com. You want to support this podcast? One great way you can do for me is you can go on your favorite podcast listening platform, may that be an Apple or Good Pods, and give me a rating. Throw me a 5-star. Type some nice things to me. If you don't even want to type, don't worry about it. Just throw me some stars. Any feedback is appreciated. I really do appreciate it. If you want to get real crazy and support me, you can always buy me a coffee. Check it out on my Quite the Thing media page. That's enough of the business. Let's get to the view. I'm excited. Joining me today is my good friend from Quite the Thing Media Network, Andy McGrillen. Andy McLovin is also what you go by, right?
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, I went by far worse, so that sounds good. McLovin, yeah.
Do you go by Andy or Andy?
Now I'm going to try and say it the right way. Andy, normally, yeah. So Andy. I probably sound really Scottish to anyone who's not Scottish, but I try to do my posh, proper voice for American listeners, so you understand me. It's easier if I talk like that, isn't it?
Just be you, man. That's all you can be. Be you.
Yes.
I'm super glad that you're on, man. So we're going to talk about, obviously, your podcast, that UFO podcast, which I'm absolutely hooked on, like I've told you. And I think it's a topic that a lot of the world is hooked on now, that a lot of these things have come to light. So this is exciting.
It's a funny time. It's been in the media, the mainstream media. Obviously, the topic of UFOs and been on worldwide news. And I think it's a subject that's going to be coming in and out of the news over the next couple of months and years as things kind of come out. So it's an exciting time to be interested in the subject. That's definitely for sure.
What I've been wondering, what I've wanted to ask you, but when I thought of it, I thought I'm going to save it for this interview. What intrigues you so much about the UFO phenomenon? Did something happen when you were younger? Something had to get you so interested in this.
I think it was my second alien abduction. I had. No, I'm joking. I think the main thing for me is when I was about 10 or 11. I was leaving. I suppose I don't think you've got it in the US, but the Boys Brigade. It's a bit like the Scouts sort of thing, but it's like one of those kind of groups. And
Gotcha.
I was leaving that winter's night, 9 o'clock-ish, and I was crossing the road in a really built-up area, lots of houses, so it's not out in the middle of nowhere. Dark sky, quite starry, and I was with 4 other people, my sister, my friend, my mum, and my friend's mum, and we were crossing the road. I was about 10, 11, 12, and along the road, about half a mile, maybe not even that far, not in the sky, but on the ground behind the houses, there was a huge object spinning. And if you imagine you're at a carnival or a fun fair and you see like a Ferris wheel, but it was slightly tilted, so like on its axis a little bit, and it was spinning really, really, really fast, probably the size of a couple of houses on top of each other. So you could see it behind the houses, but you couldn't see the bottom of it. And this thing was just there, like spinning. And it was weird because there was cars driving about and stuff, and there's shops and houses. It's not out in the middle of nowhere like you see in the movies or a TV show. Or other people were there, and we all saw it, and I kind of motioned, like, what's that? And my mum's, and to this day, my mum has no interest in this subject. She hates all things, not hates, but she's not interested in UFOs, aliens, all that kind of stuff. So when I bring it up to her now, she remembers it. She can tell you, but she has no idea what it is. But she just always says the same thing. Well, it wasn't aliens, was it? And I'm not saying it was. I've got no way of proving what it was or wasn't. I just know what we saw. It was very clear. It wasn't really far away at the size it was at, and it's what the new up-to-date podcast logo is kind of inspired by. So that happened when I was younger, and I was always interested in, I've talked about mysteries and aliens and, you know, who built the pyramids and the Loch Ness Monster and stuff like that as a kid when I was growing up. So it was natural. I think that stuck with me. And so that it's always been in the back of my head. Once you've had that sort of experience, I mean, that's as close as it got. You know, there was no beings, nothing like that. It didn't fly away. We didn't watch it. We kind of saw it and then went home. As you do, life continues. That was it. So that kind of stuck with me my whole life.
Your headbutting the mic. You're getting so excited. Oh.
Yeah, sorry. I threw my hand up. Kind of just. I was saying to you beforehand that I was messing about with my setup in here. So apologies for the boom there. I'll stop waving my hands about getting excited.
I thought you were just so excited you couldn't contain it. No, I assume that something had happened, Andy, because that's one of those things that if you do have that experience, a lot of the time you're either going to handle it one or two ways. You're going to be really intrigued, or you're going to try to like sweep it under the rug in the back of your mind and pretend it never happened. Yeah. And you obviously couldn't just do that.
No, I've always kind of kept an interest in the subject, and it was one of those things, like I've not always been one for buying lots of books on it. I've read books now and again growing up to my teenage years. I'm 35 now, but once I hit my 20s and you start going out like clubbing and going out with your mates and working, it kind of falls by the wayside. But it was always a subject, if anyone talked about, I would be more than happy to discuss. I've never ridiculed it, and I'm really interested. But as I've kind of hit my 30s, and the stuff happened with Two of the Stars Academy and the New York Times articles that we may or may not touch on, and it became a mainstream topic in the US, I picked up my interest up massively again. Social media became a bigger and bigger thing. It's easier to kind of talk to people about it and reach out, because it's not the kind of subject you can just talk to your work colleagues about or your friends about, because unless they have an interest, like it's generally stayed away from or ridiculed, or, so it's not worth really talking about it in that sense. And then it's led to me starting the podcast just over a year ago. So that's the kind of journey I've been on with it.
See, I lived out in Nevada near Las Vegas, outside of Las Vegas for over 10 years. So that is also as you know, that is a huge area for that activity. And that was always a big conversation at the time I spent out west, always talking about something like that. But I myself had never experienced it. So I heard all those stories, but I didn't really think about it. But out there, it was a very big thing.
It's a place synonymous with it as well. A lot of testing gets done out that way. Obviously, you're not far from Area 51. It's where a lot of secret US tech, nothing conspiracy-ish, but a lot of these aircraft that you see in flight now were designed 20, 30 years ago and tested out at different sites, one of them being in Nevada. So it's synonymous with UFOs, and you're going to see strange things in the sky. Not all of them, anomalous, as we call them, or unidentified as such, but there's definitely some weird things going out that way. George Knapp is a famous journalist, who is obviously based out that way as well, and he's been reporting on this subject since the late 80s in a big way. So yeah, it's a pretty cool place, and obviously you're really not far from Area 51, are you?
No, it was not very far. No, I'm not no longer, but yeah, it was very close to that, and that was always the talk. So you obviously weren't making a living your whole life off of this podcast. So what were you doing beforehand, and what led up to you saying like, hey, I'm going to start that UFO podcast. I'm going to talk about this.
Job wise, I've got a family. I've got a wife. I've got young kids. Just, normal everyday stuff. And the podcast even now just kind of fits around that. I don't make a living from it. Unfortunately, it would be a dream to do this a lot more regularly and devote even more time to it. But I've got a full-time job. I work 40 hours a week. And I train people in a telecoms company. Around that and family life, it tends to be in the evening and the weekends. And whenever I get spare time, I am recording or editing or getting in touch with guests or speaking to listeners online and a lot of different things. So the podcast, though, came about when the initial thing that sparked the idea, but it lay dormant for a while, was the second best kind of sighting I've had was in December 2019. And I was driving home from work. It was like 6 o'clock in the evening. And like anywhere, the roads are busy at peak times when people are coming home from work. And I take a back road sometimes to kind of avoid the bulk of the traffic. You go a longer way. It's a country road, but it's still pretty busy. So again, I'm not out this way myself. It's a pretty busy road. And driving along, I noticed there was kind of two light, not too high up in the sky. And just probably 100 feet in the air, there's a tree line I drive past, so I know roughly how high it is. And I thought it was an aircraft because, admittedly, it's very near an airport. So straight away, it's there's a small plane, but really low down. And as I drove a little bit closer along this road, the two lights hadn't moved. Okay. But again, I know different effects, and especially doing this now, when you see people who analyse videos and pictures and footage, it can just be the way you're driving, the speed an aircraft's going at can look like it's sitting still, but it's not. It's actually moving. Especially when they come into land and stuff, they can look different as well. But anyway, I kept driving, and a few more seconds passed, and I noticed these two lights definitely don't seem to be moving. And at the side of the road, another car had pulled over. It was like a white van. And the guy was leaning out his window and looking up at these two lights that, again, about 100 feet in the sky. And as I drove underneath it, only because I was looking at the 2 points of light, you could make out the black triangular shape. So the 2 points of light were on what would be the back two corners, and the front would have been pointing, away from me.
Yeah.
You would not have seen this if those 2 points of light weren't there, because it was so black against the night sky. So the shape of it was incredible because you could just make out the black against the kind of night sky. I drove a little bit further along the road, and I phoned my wife. That the first thing I thought to do, it's a road you have to drive fast on. Okay, it's like 60 miles an hour, whatever that is in different places in the world. So you can't just like pull out your phone and get the video ready and record, because you've kind of got to watch what you're doing. It's a country road. So I pulled in the first place I could, a little bit further along, and I could still see this thing in my rear view mirror. And this is a point to why I started the podcast, by the way. It's not just a random story. So when I pulled in and I was on the phone to my wife, and I like I say, I don't know why I phoned her. She's not got a huge interest in this subject, and I was kind of commentating my way through it, saying, it's there, it's still there. It was like a black triangle. It was in the sky. And I turned round, and this elderly couple came out because I'd kind of pulled onto their drive to turn round. And they said to me, "Oh, can we help you?" And I was like, no, sorry, I'm just using your drive. Sorry if I bumped the mic again. We're just using your drive. I've moved away from it to turn round. They were like, "Oh yeah, no problem." And I was like, there's something sitting in the sky along there. And I pointed, and I just remember like the old guy kind of looked along the road, and he laughed, and he just went, "Oh, it just shows you there's something else out there, isn't there?" And he said goodnight and went in his house. He saw this thing, so I reversed out onto the road to drive back along towards it, just to kind of see if I could get closer to it. And as I was starting to go back along the road, I noticed it was starting to move away over the top of the tree line, but another light had came on at the front of it, and it was like flashing really sporadically. So I drove round a corner, along the road and round a corner, kind of lost it over the top of the trees. But over the top of these trees, once you get round this corner, it's a huge field and a massive expanse where there's nothing that would hide it. And it just wasn't there. I couldn't see it. And I just had to drive home. When I got home, I told my wife the whole story again. And it was this. And I kept going over it. And she just said to me, like, "You talk about this like really passionately." And she said like she doesn't care. But she was like, "You should do that for a living. If you could talk about UFOs." Or I was always like, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to more podcasts than I watch TV or movies or stream Netflix and stuff like that. So I've always wanted to do one. But like anything, if you play football or soccer or whatever, you always want to do that. And as I've got older, I love podcasts, and I hear people do them that just start one up themselves in like a garage, or their house or a flat or a basement. Never crossed my mind again until the whole COVID thing came up. And basically it was my birthday. I bought a microphone, and I decided that if I was ever going to do it, being in a lockdown would be the best time, because we're going to have lots of spare time. I have no excuses in the world. No excuses. I'm going to have spare time. And if not, it would sit in the box. After a month, I would sell it. And the microphone did sit in the box for about 2 or 3 weeks. And at that point, I got in touch with a few people, sent out some emails. I didn't even have a name for the podcast at that point. I was driving along the road one day, and I was like, what would I call it? And I was thinking, what would people search for if they were looking for or what would they talk about? And people would type UFO podcast. Yeah, but there's already stuff called UFO podcast and podcast UFO. And I was like, a kind of quirky name. And I was like, oh, but that UFO podcast, because, people say, have you heard that UFO podcast? What one? Well, it's called that UFO podcast. That was exactly how it went in my head, and that's how it came up. But eventually Gary Voorhees, who was my first guest, who was the Spy 1 radar operator on a famous incident in 2004 off the coast of California, he agreed to come on and talk to me about that event. and it kind of went from there. So that's the kind of story of how it all got started. Apologies if it's long-winded, but that is A to Z.
It's good, and that's how I assumed it started. Obviously, I've listened to that episode, and I've seen Gary off watching things on TV. Gary was really the first piece that you had as far as a visitor, and then you were really able to build that over time and continuing to get. I don't want to say Gary's not legitimate, because that's not what I'm saying, but you continue to find people in the field that are a step up as far as popularity and the impact that they make. So you started with Gary, and then did he put in a good word for you? And that's how you kind of just kept meeting new people?
Not at first. So I reached out to Gary, and he was really good. And the idea was if 20 people listen, because I've got no background in any of this, and I know sometimes people start these things and they've been on TV or they've had another podcast or all different manner of things. And I literally did start from nothing. I had a YouTube account that I was going to use to post UFO pictures with 70 followers that I never used. Gary came on, I broke down the event with him. I had bullet points and some notes on a notepad, and I thought it would last 20 minutes, and it lasted 2 hours talking to him. I put it out and really roughly threw it together. The editing stuff, I learned all that myself. It was painstaking the first couple of times doing it, because it was a lot of YouTube videos and trial and error. And I put out the first episode and it went well. So the idea with Gary was, Gary has become increasingly popular since, not because of my podcast, but just timing and different things. But I hadn't seen Gary had done a lot of interviews, and I wanted someone who I thought would be relatively accessible, in the sense I'd saw him as a talking head on Unidentified, the season on history, and on the A&E network. And I thought, he's not done a whole lot. I Googled him. He'd done 1 or 2 other interviews. Maybe he'll come on if he's not overwhelmed with requests. And he seems a really nice guy. And he was, and he is. And I still keep in touch with him now. And then the same for Sean Cahill. Sean Cahill's blown up to the point he's on Fox News, CNN, Good Morning America, UK television, Australian, Irish, all over the world. And Sean Cahill is now a good friend as well. But these guys at the time were just starting to get their names out there. And be asked a lot more about different events and incidents. And I think they've become trusted. And I was just lucky to kind of get them early as they kind of made their names and their kind of way into the world of UFOs. And from there, honestly, I just reached out to people. And maybe there's a massive element of luck with it, that as the audience grew pretty quickly, it was a case of, I just felt I was kind of bumping up the guests. And Tim McGrillen was probably quite a big one to get. He was my 5th guest. And really good journalist, really serious journalist on a lot of different topics, particularly when it comes to the US military, US Department of Defense, UFOs, UAPs, as they're known. And that kind of helped me take a step up in who would come on. And I think the reputation I started to get was that, as the guests would tell me at the end of the recordings, off air, which was really nice to hear. And it was always one thing for myself. I don't usually talk about this, but, I will, I really enjoyed that. Your questions were actually quite refreshing, or, it was a little bit different. I wasn't copying anyone's style. I listened to a lot of different interviews and things like that for different subjects. So I think I've just got a bit of a mishmash of all different things I've heard. And that kind of makes up my interviewing style. So that's done me well. I've always been really polite and courteous, and I've not had many people refuse to come on or not get back to me in that sense, which is really nice. So it's in a really good place now, and very quickly I think I managed to get an audience or a guest list that other guests have seen, and I think they realise it's a pretty credible platform to come on and talk.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. And because of you, I actually have watched Identified and all these things that you're talking about. And crazy enough, I actually know these individuals that you're talking about. I don't know them personally, but I know them from this. So yeah, I've listened to the majority of these episodes, man, and I love it. It's so intriguing. I think the George, as we talked about, he was an awesome interview to me, because he just has that style and that personality. I really enjoyed those. I mean, do you still keep in touch with George?
Yeah, the George Knapp interview. So the podcast started April. Well, I say started. I done the first interview in April 2020, and it was published on May the 1st on Audio Boom. And then kind of from there, it's kind of went on. But it's really weird, like you say, those people that you see on those programs, that I was the same, that I watched that first series, and now I've got those guys' phone numbers, and I keep in touch with them, and it's so strange. And the A&E network, I've got press access with them now, and I keep in touch with the press officer there. And so yeah, I'd love to say that I had this grand plan or way of getting all these contacts and this stuff to happen, but it's probably just been luck. But George Knapp, again, someone I've followed for years, especially, he's a very, very credible, well-known journalist and personality, especially when it comes to UFOs. He's done so much hard work and research over the decades. He actually interviewed me first on his Mystery Wire YouTube channel as part of a group I created or co-created called UAP Media UK, which is a group about getting the UK press and politicians to try and engage in the UFO subject seriously. It's very, very difficult, let alone anywhere in the world, but the UK is so hard to have that conversation in any serious way in the mainstream media. And George Knapp reached out to our group through his producer, and we were on his show, and he had heard about mine, which he mentioned on the on his podcast, and he said, I'd love to come on and be interviewed by you sometime, which I was... Yep, that would be a dream, and it very quickly got arranged. So it was amazing to speak to him and ask him questions, and because that's his whole life. For him, it's so natural; he just does it. I imagine with almost no prep now whatsoever. But yeah, so that was pretty cool. But it was nice to have him interview us first, and then for me to interview George.
I do want to take another second here to talk about the sponsor of this podcast, Good Pods. Like I mentioned earlier in the intro, you can see what podcasts your friends and influencers are listening to. This app is great, and the creators and team Good Pods are very serious about making you the greatest listening experience for podcasts. Not only just the quality of the audio listening piece, but also the social aspect. This is a really awesome app. I can't suggest it enough. I'm very involved in there. They're very dedicated to podcasters, independent podcasters, and listeners. I have a couple groups on there you should go check out. The Indie Podcasters group, highlight indie podcasters, obviously. I've also recently created a true crime group. I'm a big true crime fan. You should join both of those groups. And every week, we do pick podcasts out of the Indie Podcasters group to highlight in the recommended section. But once again, I'll say it again, the Good Pods team is a great team of people. I can personally vouch for them, but they're also dedicated to making this app as good as possible. You can talk to them on social media directly. They will respond. They take all recommendations very serious. There's a great team at Good Pods. Make sure you download the Good Pods app and listen to your podcast there. Let's get back to the interview. Yeah, to me, he's been the one that I have seen talking publicly about it for so long. So when I heard that episode, I immediately made that connection as far as him being the ultimate press professional in regard to this topic. That was just super awesome when you got him. But you worked your way up, and I'll let you speak to it, but I could guess that there was one person that you really wanted to interview. And I'm going to let you go from there because you're probably guessing what I'm thinking. How did you get to that?
Yeah, so the February, before I spoke to George Knapp, I managed to get Luis Elizondo, who is the main guy who ran the Department of Defense, the Pentagon's UFO program called ATIP. And this was all part of a big story that broke from the New York Times in 2017 in December. And he was part of a group, To the Stars Academy. People can research and look into all that backstory and who was involved. But he basically was the guy he left his job in the government, a job he loved, and came out and said, these things are real. There's something flying about. It's basically taking the piss out of our military. Our military can do nothing with it. They fly around, they mess about with our equipment, and we don't know what they are. We don't know who controls them, and it needs to be investigated and taken seriously. So Lou Elizondo is just, again, he's on all those documentaries, and he's a guy that I really look up to and respect for what he's come out and said and what he's done. And in some parts, he's a controversial character. I think anyone in the subject of UFOs is scrutinised really heavily because it's very divided as to what people believe and what they think. And obviously, when you've got a guy coming out saying, I ran the US government's UFO program, which they denied for decades they had or had any interest in, then that's a pretty big deal. So yeah, I was really fortunate. Sean Cahill, who was my second guest, I've kept in touch with for a long time, and I still we catch up regularly, and he comes on the podcast quite a lot. He's really close with Lou, and that's how I got the connection with Lou. But it's nice to have the opportunity now that I can reach out to Lou on a one-to-one basis and ask him for comments or quotes on any breaking stories. That I don't bug him. I think he does a lot in the media, and he's so nice. He says yes to a lot of people. It's nice to have that relationship as well with Lou now, that he was like my number one on my guest list. I want to speak to Lou Elizondo. That guest list kind of rapidly, my bucket list for guests got used up pretty quickly. And I think the only two left off of that from year one would be Chris Mellon, who was the former Under Secretary of Defence for the US, who is a colleague of Lou Elizondo's, and Tom DeLonge, former Blink-182 frontman, but also has a heavy interest in the subject as well. So there's a few new names on that wish list.
You touched up on it. When they come forward with something like this, it's a little bit different than with you or I do. Chris Mellon, Lou, all these guys that have had big time names in the government. I can only imagine the scrutiny they've faced. And they kind of been, I guess it's a simple term would be disowned.
It was really difficult for them to have those conversations. And I think more so than Lou, Chris Mellon, his family history is incredible. You know, if anyone thinks they're in this for money, one, Lou wouldn't have left his very high paying job in the government to do what he's done. And two, Chris Mellon's family are billionaires. And he was the former Undersecretary for Defence for the United States. So these are people that they were in very high-ranking, powerful positions, and they've just got a massive interest in the subject. And from a United States point of view, they're very much looking at the people's interests as far as they're concerned, and that it's a worldwide phenomenon, as is now known. You know, it's not just a US problem as much as that's a Hollywood issue, that everything happens in the States. As a worldwide issue. But yeah, they were I suppose, like if you work in an office with 100 people and you've got an interest in this subject, you'll be known as the UFO guy, you know, and then people will talk about it and someone will come up and you like UFOs, you know, aliens, you think there's aliens? These guys got that at the highest government levels. So yeah, and they've been privy to a lot of information, and that's not to say they've seen all the files and know everything that's going on. But they've probably got a pretty good idea and understanding of how they want to drive the conversation. I think they've been very clever and very tactical, very strategic about how they've gone about this in their business. But they're very well respected men.
Yeah. So what about you, Andy? Did you face a lot of scrutiny growing up? Were you hesitant to bring this up and discuss this with people? Because I know for myself, when something's on my mind, it's really hard not to talk about it if I'm passionate about it.
I think for me, it was a case of I've never had an issue talking about it. It was more that if it was brought up, I wouldn't shy away from the conversation. At any age, you know, I've got no problem saying I maybe can articulate it better now, and, you know, having focused on it more, especially the last year with the podcast and everything, and speaking to different guests and helping me shape and form opinion as I've gone along. But even growing up, I've never been afraid to say, well, why wouldn't there be something else out there? You know, yeah, but it's not aliens. Well, why not? Because everyone just thinks of, they can't do this because we can't. And it's a very human way to look at a solution. You know, we can't do it, so they couldn't. Yeah, but it's too far. Okay, it's too far for us. Yeah, you couldn't travel at that speed. Yeah, okay, we can't travel at that speed. You know, why would they come here? Well, why do we send a rover to Mars, which is now sitting in a crater, sending a little toy helicopter up in the air every couple of days? That sounds crazy. Why would you do that? But, you know, humans have done it. So it's just trying to you're trying to comprehend things from a human perspective, and that's not to say that these things are necessarily ET or extraterrestrial, which is your basic, you know, aliens coming from another planet. I think as you get into the subject and you look past that, it's just, what if it's something else? What if there's more to it than aliens come from this planet to us in flying saucers, just to use that term? Okay, it seems there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot more going on than I think people would realize or understand.
So you've never had an issue talking about it necessarily, but you didn't go out of your way to start a conversation about it throughout the years.
Yeah, rarely, unless the time was right. You know, it's not something I wouldn't start day one of a new job or be out with friends and say, let's talk about UFOs, let's talk about aliens. It was just, if it came up, then I'm happy to have that conversation. More so now. I think a lot of my friends don't know I do this still. Not that I hide it from them. I'd say like my close friends know, but work colleagues and other people like that. Not that again I've hid it. It's just I've not gone out my way to. Oh, I've got a podcast. That's it. When I first started it, if it came up in passing, oh, what have you been up to? Oh, I started a podcast because I was, lockdown and stuff. Early days, yeah, but I've got a lot of people who know me that probably still don't know I do this.
Interesting. Well, I mean, and your podcast has really benefited from like all the activities that are going on, like you've said, but you've also worked pretty hard to build it. How do you find the time to do that with working and family? And in my opinion, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to agree. There's a lot of research that goes into something like this. How do you find the time to research? I think the answer might be I see you online at all times of the day.
Honestly, it's just like, for example, if I'm going to be listening to or speaking to a guest, I'll listen to some podcasts I've done from different points of time. So if I'm walking my dog or driving in the car, like I've dropped the kids off at school, I'll put one of those on and I'll just listen to bits and pieces and I'll make notes on my phone. Sometimes I'll reach out to my regular co-host, Dan, and I'll ask him, can you get me some stuff on this guest? What would be a good direction to go? I do have sometimes guests that I don't have too much time to research. So I'm pretty good, I suppose, if you look at things that I do well, because the podcast's successful. So it'd be stupid of me to sit here and go, oh, it's all just luck. So there must be something I'm doing or some things I'm doing right. I think I've got a bit of a knack for just asking the right questions. Just starting a conversation and seeing where it goes. I try and not overly script or write down too much for my interviews and stuff. Because for me, it's one of the reasons I did start the podcast about UFOs, because it was going to be football/soccer or UFOs. That was the two options. And there's a whole load of football podcasts already. For me, this again is something I'm really passionate about as well. I listened to a few other podcasts and I would get frustrated that they would have a guest on that I was really interested in hearing. One, it would always be the interviewer talking like too much. If it's an hour long interview, I don't want to hear half an hour of the guest and half an hour of the interviewer. I want to hear the interviewer for 5 or 10 minutes at most, and I want to hear 50 minutes from the guest, because it's them that really interest me. And I think that's the same with my podcast, that people aren't tuning in because it's Andy speaking to Luis Elizondo. They want to hear him. So I try and ask the questions and sit back, which people seem to appreciate that style of things. And what I would hear as well was people would ask a good question. Everyone can sit and write down an interview. Anyone can do that. And more in the last year, I think I started the podcast at a good time, that this was just before it really hit the media big. So it wasn't like I was jumping on a bandwagon, which in the last few months, there's been so many UFO podcasts I've seen just crop up, and they're all doing the same thing. And it's not that there shouldn't be more podcasts. There's room for thousands of podcasts on each subject. However, people will just hear someone else and they go and do the same format, the same type of guest, the same conversation. And it's not being themselves. It's like you have to kind of find a niche. So there's been a lot of that going on. But again, when you ask a guest a question, like I say, you can write down 100 questions, but it's the follow-ups that come up naturally within the interview. And there would be times I would hear, the host of a podcast ask a question, the guest gives a really good answer, and you hear something, you think, oh, follow up on that. That's really interesting. He said that. And the interviewer just moves on. And it's like, but he mentioned this. And for me, that's the difference, where I can sit and speak to people and follow up on the moment. I don't have to have it written down in front of me or have a prompt. I don't mind, because even like I'm doing now, I just go off on a tangent, okay, which is your podcast, so this one's your problem. But on my podcast, it's like, well, do you know what? I had this question next, but I'm going to ask this instead because you said this and that's really interesting. Tell me more about it or follow up on it. And that's the way I kind of like to go on the podcast as well. So that's kind of helped out a little bit.
And before we were recording, we were talking about that, how I was telling you, like, well, I don't have anything set really. I'm just going to live in the moment and go for it. So a follow-up, as you're talking about, what about the intimidation factor? You actually speak to some high-ranking previous government officials. Were ever a few times when you thought, and I've heard you ask a few pretty questions that could be considered intimidating by some. How did that feel doing that? Were you nervous?
No. The only 2 interviews I've done where I was nervous, but it was kind of nervous excitement for Lou Elizondo, and a bit of the same for George Knapp. But with both of those, even after I start recording, I'm fine. I don't get the nerves. I've always been pretty confident talking to people. Anyway, I can talk. You know, it helps when you've got a podcast. But yeah, it's never bothered me. I think as I've gotten older as well, you kind of realise no matter what jobs people are in, they're just people. I think the beauty of having a podcast and recording it as well, not that I've ever had to do this, but if it goes badly, no one has to hear that. You know, if it's me and you talking right now, and at the end of this, you know, you think this is the worst podcast you've ever heard, or, you know, this is the worst conversation you've ever had, it doesn't ever have to go out. So I think there's always that safety net for me of it doesn't matter. You know, I do very little editing on the podcast anyway. I think it's just keep the natural conversation going, and what happened. And that's the way the conversation went. If a question kind of dies a little bit, then so be it. That wasn't the best way to go. Find something else. So it's kind of natural that way. But other than a little bit of nerves or butterflies before a couple of recordings, I've always just been happy to sit and it's just me and that person talking. And honestly, I think I would be okay if it was live as well. I think I've just uploaded my 102nd show in what will be 14 months. And I know that sounds like a lot, but some of those were like 15-minute breaking news podcasts, or half-an-hour discussions, or 45-minute breaking news podcasts. The interviews tend to go an hour to 2 hours. So yeah, I've done quite a lot in a short time already, but I think I've kind of got a rhythm with it now as well. That again, if I manage to get Chris Mellon, I'm a little bit nervy for that maybe, but it's just you and them having a conversation. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, for sure. And you actually sometimes ask things that you really probably don't know how it's going to go, because it is confidential information with some of these people. So, you know, what the hell are they going to answer? How are they going to answer? You really don't know. I mean, I can ask you anything and it is what it is, but some of these people that you've talked to, they got to really be careful on what they say and how they say it.
I think with that side of it, especially when it's been the military or like Lou Elizondo particularly, which will be the example most people would know or go and listen to. If you were going to listen to one, you would jump onto the Lou Elizondo podcast first, or George Knapp. I think they're episodes 27 and 32, and I only know that because those are the two biggest podcasts I've done. The confidential side of it, though, for me, that's the stuff where if I do have to ask something like that, it's just trying to be a little bit clever with the wording of it. You're not going to trip up people who were in the Department of Defence and, you know, the military and have done this for decades, who are trained to answer or not answer, you know, in certain ways. So no matter how good I am at interviewing, they're not going to slip up and tell me something. So there's no point in asking them, oh, so are there aliens? Stupid question. The people say there's no such thing as stupid questions. There is. Or you'll ask them, so have you ever seen a flying saucer, or have you seen a spaceship? What's the point? Because they're going to say no, or I can't answer that. So you can do the whole asking a question that sounds like, oh, that would be really interesting, but you're not going to get an answer to just for the sake of it. Or you can put a little bit of time and effort and try and frame it and word it in a way that they can talk about it. Or again, asking opinions can be a little loose on that one as well, because of kind of a knowledge bias they might have already. But I think just how you frame the questions can make all the difference. I think analogies work really well. I like analogies. I'm really fond of them. Asking a guest a question that they can touch on, and then asking for an analogy. So what would that be like, or what would that be similar to? And they can kind of do that. I think that tends to work well in some of the interviews.
You've been doing it throughout this whole episode, but I'm going to ask you in a little bit further detail. And I've asked everybody this that I've interviewed. What advice, because you are a content creator and you've built this podcast up to where it's doing really well. What advice would you give somebody that's just starting out? May it be a podcast or anything from a, you know, maybe audio creative standpoint?
Honestly, from a creation side of things and starting out and what do you want to do, you have to be yourself with it. If you are listening to another podcast and trying to replicate it, don't even start. It's not going to work. It's not going to take off. It'll just fail because you don't sound like you for a kickoff. I saw a podcast quite recently that's relatively new, nice host, but the description of one of their shows they released a day after one of mine is almost word for word. And that's fine and it's flattering, okay? Might be purely coincidental, but it's almost the same show. And it's pointless. It's just like that's not you. Sorry, I hit the mic there. That's not you. There's a good bit of advice. Don't change your microphone setup 5 minutes before you go on an interview with someone. So apologies, folks. I did say before, I've just been moving stuff about a little bit and I shouldn't have done that beforehand. So don't ever do that. But yeah, you have to be yourself. And I liked, especially when I was younger, wrestling, WWF, WWE and all that kind of stuff. And one of the wrestlers, Scott Hall, on a documentary said that he's always listened to everyone's advice, but it's important you make your own decisions. And I think that's always been really good advice I've kind of tried to live by as well, that, listen to little bits of what everyone tells you and take bits from other people's styles. And something you hear someone does, I listen to UFO podcasts and wrestling podcasts and a few comedy review podcasts. And I think if people went and listened to everything I listen to, they would hear maybe little bits and pieces from all of those and how I do what I do. I don't have to put it on. I don't force it. I don't plan it. It's just me. And if you like it, great. If you don't, I can't really change what I do because this is what I'm comfortable with and this is what's natural. And I think that has to be the same for other people. From a technical standpoint, I think you have to put in a little bit of effort when it comes from, what the podcast sounds like, the quality of it. I've always fretted over the audio quality from the start. I wanted it to sound good.
You must hate my podcast then. Oh, man.
No, do you know what? Listen, it sounds better than a lot of podcasts that start up, promise you. And listen, I'll tell you, amateur mistake, right? My first, it must be like 5, 6, 7 episodes, right? I was recording the intro separately to the podcast. So I would do, hi, this is Andy, that UFO podcast, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't realise using the software I was using that I was selecting the default on the laptop, not the microphone that I've got. So I thought I was recording into my fancy microphone I'd bought, but I wasn't. It was plugged in, but it was the laptop's default, okay? So there was a huge... I couldn't work out why the audio quality sounded so different for the first couple of minutes. And then when I spoke to the guest, it went up in quality. And then I realised eventually after a couple of weeks, oh my God, I can't believe I've been doing that. So you will make stupid mistakes. You just have to learn from it and kind of move on. And I will give this free piece of advice for anyone, okay? Best thing I've ever come across for my podcast, and it was given to me from OSW Review, which is a wrestling video podcast on YouTube, hugely successful. 3 Irish guys who started out literally, and they still do the same thing 10 years later. It's 3 friends reviewing old wrestling shows. They're really funny, and they just done it for fun, and now it is their full-time jobs, and they deserve it because they're so funny and they're nice. And I reached out when I first started this and asked them. I actually reached out to a few podcasts and asked, if you got any advice for me starting mine, any equipment I should buy. I'm not massively technically minded. I don't have this kind of audio technician background or anything. What should I do? What shouldn't I do? And he said, you know what? Get a good microphone. And the other thing is, there's a piece of software called the Levelator. It's free. It was, I think you can see on Wikipedia, it was made by some students at a university as a project, basically. And it's a free piece of software online. It's literally, when you click open, a little black box appears on your screen. You drag and drop WAV files into it, and it levels out the sound across the whole file. So if your guest's quiet and you're loud, or at different points, the sound changes and goes up and down, and you've got multiple guests, even the music or the intros or sound effects, it levels all the sound automatically for you. So I drop WAV files into that and then convert them to MP3s, and it totally levels out the sound. Totally free, really easy to do. It's a drag and drop, and it makes a massive difference to the quality of your podcast as well. So that's if anyone gets use out of that, the Levelator, you can get it online free.
Yeah, I use it. It is amazing. You're right. It's simple as drag and drop. I was so excited to have you on because you really are a great resource for, I'm just going to say, indie podcasters. It's important for them to have somebody that they can ask questions to. Like a lot of us do we do that to you and, our Quite the Thing media group, but it is important for somebody to have that person that they can go to and ask for advice. I really respect that you're always available for that.
No, thanks. And it's only $50 if you pay. No, I'm joking. Yeah, anyone who ever wanted to ask anything, I can only give you my opinion. Up to you what you go and do with the information. But like I say, here's what I've done. Here's how I record, how I edit. Things I do, things I don't do. I'll tell you all the things I've done wrong back at the start. My first podcast, I think, took me 5 hours to edit together, and it was nowhere near the quality it's at now. and I don't mean the content of it. Gary was great, but do you know what? Even then, there's something like, as you get confident, don't compromise the quality of your podcast as well. Gary was a really good guest, but at the time he recorded, because of the time difference from UK to California. He's got a kid. I've got kids. I know what it's like, but I'm lucky I've got a separate space to record. He had his kid in the background, so throughout the whole podcast, you hear the kid and the noise and stuff like that, and that's not his fault. He can't help that. But if that happened now, I would just be rescheduling or re-recording. So don't be scared to move it, because what you've got to think of is, if someone goes and listens to that as your first ever episode, say you've done 10 or 20 or 30, but whoever goes and listens to that as a first, that could make or break if they listen to it anymore. So with each episode you put out, if you're going to create a podcast, you've got to think, if someone listened to this for the first time and they're only going to give it probably a couple of minutes, in that first couple of minutes, are they going to understand what your podcast's about? Are they going to hear the quality they're going to get from it? Then it's think about that, especially as the podcast grows. What I do, and this is just me, and I'm sure there's people like me, but there's other people who go straight to the first episode. When I find a new podcast, one that's been going for a while, I'll listen to like a very recent episode, because you're going to hear a difference in quality from, and I appreciate this more now, from what it sounds like now to how it started. And if I like it how it sounds now, I'll go back to the early episodes and work my way through the back catalogue, because that lets you hear the evolution of the podcast, and you'll hear the sound changes. You hear the equipment changing as they go along as well. And I'll use that OSW podcast for a start. I mean, you could hear they recorded it all around one cheap, shoddy microphone and uploaded it to a video that was kind of badly edited together. Whereas now, some of their stuff takes a month to produce because of the quality of it. But there's a reason they've got 10,500 Patreons. You know, it's that makes all the difference. And especially when it comes to audio podcasts, people will give it a minute, couple of minutes. So it's making sure from the get-go, people can hear the quality, that your intro is good, that it sounds crisp, it sounds clear, that if you've got any sound effects, you're not overdoing them, and everything's leveled out nicely. And then from the off, they're hearing what your podcast's all about. That kind of stuff really important, because almost no one is sitting down to listen to a half-hour, 45-minute, 2-hour long podcast and then deciding whether they like it or not. You're getting a couple of minutes at most.
Great advice. I could talk to you all day about this, and I think this is a useful episode for people. But I'm going to give you 2 quick UFO sort of questions, and then let you get back to your day.
Cool, man.
If you could go back in time, or even go today, to one crash site, what would it be and why?
So you said crash site, so it's not even just an incident, but just so it had to be a crash.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you know about plenty of them. Those are the ones that really intrigue me.
Yeah. I think you would have to go back to Roswell. I don't think there's any options. It was over 75 years ago now. Most of the witnesses are dead, or they're kids that are really elderly or passed on themselves. So it's one that there's not a lot of footage of. There's some still pictures. That's it. There's a lot of rumor, a lot of mystery around it. But I would love to just be up in the hills and watching as whatever came down and crashed. And I'll just throw in, if indeed it was an accidental crash, or whether it was crashed deliberately.
Bob Lazar, what do you think about him?
I reckon the Bob Lazar story is 85% true. And then I think there's some grey areas within it. I think he did work there. He did work on back engineering some exotic materials and potentially an ET spacecraft. If we're going to say ET, it could be ultra-terrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, could be maybe it's another race, intelligent race that's based on Earth that we don't know about, And if you're new to that whole concept, think Wakanda and Black Panther. There's a whole civilization on this planet that we just don't know is there. There's some big oceans out there, which, as amazing as that sounds, it's starting to look like there's a real possibility. So I think the Bob Lazar story has a lot of truth to it. And like anything, and I think we've seen this recently with, right or wrong, the way Donald Trump manipulated the media, you can have a lot of truth in a story, and it only takes 1 or 2 small lies that makes you doubt the rest of the truth. And I think that happens a lot within UFOs and the stories that go around it, that it's very easy to discredit anything by just picking apart very small details that are wrong or having little white lies in there. it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of truth to what's happening as well. So I think it's for the most part true.
We call the Donald Trump reference fake news over here, Andy.
Yeah, the fake news. But do you know what? The fake news stuff was very much, I don't believe that, so I'm going to talk down or downplay it. But I think, like any politician, not even just Donald Trump, they tell so many lies. And this is any politician, right? Forget your political leanings. I'm not political at all. I don't care. Every politician worldwide very much does the same thing, okay? They just lie to different degrees. To a point, it's very hard to pick out the truth and pick out the lies. And the stories, I think, can get kind of, like when you're a kid and you have a memory of something that happened as a child, but you embellish it at the time so much, what happened. Then as you grow older, the incident in your head, you remember it that way. So you remember it as being more spectacular or more incredible or more interesting or more scary than it was. I think that's what can happen a lot, again, within the field of UFO, is that there's so many stories that get told throughout the years. And as they get told and different people get involved and you hear different versions of stories, little details change here and there. And that's where it can get really confusing. A really good analogy I told you, like analogies I heard was, if you ask me and my wife, our wedding day was 7 years ago. I think I'm getting that right, almost 7 years ago in November. If you ask us to talk about events that happened on the day, we'll tell you them. And do you know what? We'll tell you from two different perspectives. And they'll probably mostly be the same, but there'll be small details that one of us gets wrong and the other one doesn't. It doesn't mean we're lying. It just means that's the way we remember it. And I think that's what kind of goes on with the world of UFOs and other things as well.
Great analogy, man. I like that. I'm going to have to remember that one. I'm going to use that for sure.
Someone else.
So two things to the ending of this. One, where did you, and who is part of that awesome theme song to your podcast? And two, because there's going to be people listening to this that haven't heard of your podcast, even though it is becoming greatly popular. How can they find it?
So everyone loves the theme song. So do you know what? I'm going to give a little bit of love to the intro, because the intro is Adam Goldsat, who is part of UAP Media as well. So it's an original piece of music that he had created years ago. And I asked him if he knew anything, and he said he'd made some stuff. And I found that the really popular one, which is the outro, again, original piece of music, because I didn't want to just use stuff that was copyrighted or whatever. It's Sean Cahill, who was my second guest. It was recorded by him. You'll find it on YouTube under Minty Hyperspace, and the song's called Goblin Problems. If anyone likes it, I'll send you over the MP3 file. I get asked for it like loads of times in a month anyway. But it's a really cool, very catchy song. And when I asked Sean if I could use it, he just said to me, "You can have it. It's yours. Just that's it. On you go." So I was really lucky. The second part of that, how people can find the podcast, is available on Apple podcast platforms. You can subscribe now on Apple as well, and you get a 2-week free trial, but there's bonus content, premium content. I asked my guests to stay on an extra 10, 15 minutes for some additional listener questions and some extra bonus stuff to talk about. And there's some exclusive, premium, I call it premium just now, the service only stuff on there as well. Same with patreon.com/that UFO podcast. You can sign up on there. There's some merchandise and stuff that goes along with it. But the main thing is people listen. If people can't contribute and support it that way, then just listening to the podcast, liking it, sharing it, retweeting it, leaving a review is huge. If no one listened to it, then, there'd be no point in doing it, which is the main thing for me.
Again, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and do this interview. Thanks a lot. Anytime.
I look forward to the next one.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to ask you just about every other day. I'm not even going to record them. You're just going to think I am. I'm just saving them, archiving them.
That's fine, man.
All right. Thanks, man. Really do appreciate you listening to this episode and checking it out. I hope you continue to do so with the next. I hope you have an appreciation for what I'm trying to do here. Highlight all the different things all sorts of different creators are doing. I hope you get behind me on that and continue to join me on my journey. I'm Podcast Father, the Indie Podcaster. See you next time.